The silver light exploded outward from Seraphina's skin like a supernova contained in flesh, bathing the entire stone courtyard in ethereal radiance that turned midnight into something closer to dawn. Every wolf present dropped to their knees in a single synchronized movement, heads bowed in reverence and terror, unable to withstand the ancient power radiating from the small Omega who stood at the center of it all. Five massive figures remained standing unmoved by the divine display. Five Alpha Kings surrounded her like points on a star, their eyes glowing with reflected moonlight and something deeper, something primal and possessive that transcended even the goddess's power. Caden Thorne would step forward, his dark hair falling across scarred features as he reached for her face with surprising gentleness. His voice cut through the shocked silence with absolute authority. The first bond is sealed. You're ours now forever. Riker moved to her other side, identical to his twin, in every physical way but burning with barely contained fire where Caden radiated ice. Our mate, our Luna, our queen. Ashton, Kyle, and Dorian closed the circle, their larger frames creating a wall of muscle and dominance that declared without words that anyone who wanted to reach Seraphina would have to go through all five of them first. And not a single wolf in the assembled crowd doubted that such an attempt would end in bloodshed. The pack bowed, lower foreheads pressed to cold stone, and a single chant began to rise from hundreds of throats. Luna Queen, Luna Queen, Luna Queen. Seraphina's legs trembled beneath her, overwhelmed by the power still coursing through her veins like liquid silver, by the mate bond thrumming in her chest like a second heartbeat synchronized with Caden's. She swayed slightly, and immediately all five alphas reached for her, steadying her with warm hands and warmer scents that wrapped around her like a blanket. We've got you, Dorian rumbled in that deep voice that seemed to vibrate through her bones. Always. But 3 months ago she had been alone in the darkness waiting to burn. The memory crashed over her like ice water, pulling her away from the present triumph and dragging her back to that stone cell where everything had changed. Back to the moment five strangers had walked through a heavy door and altered the course of her entire existence with nothing more than a look and a single word breathed in unison. Mate, Seraphina Whitmore had been certain she would die screaming as flames consumed her flesh. The stone cell was cold enough that her breath misted in the air, despite the warmth of late summer outside these thick walls. She'd been here 3 days now. Wrists rubbed raw from iron shackles that connected to chains bolted high on the wall, forcing her to remain standing, with her arms stretched overhead in a position that made her shoulders scream with agony and her legs tremble with the effort of keeping herself upright. 3 days since the villagers had dragged her from the small cottage at the forest's edge where she'd lived alone since her grandmother's death 6 months prior. 3 days since they'd torn through her home with righteous fury, destroying everything the old woman had built over a lifetime of quiet healing. The dried herbs hanging from the rafters had been ripped down and trampled. The carefully labeled jars of salves and tinctures had been smashed against the walls. The ancient books with their yellowed pages and careful notations about which plants stopped bleeding and which brought down fever had been thrown into the fire pit and burned while she watched, held immobile by rough hands and rougher accusations. Which they'd screamed, demon worshiper, cursed thing that should never have been born. The white linen shift they'd left her in was torn at the shoulder from careless handling, exposing pale skin that seemed to glow in the dim light, filtering through the single narrow window set high in the wall. Her hair white as fresh snow and falling in tangled waves past her waist caught what little illumination existed and reflected it back like spun silver. Even her eyes were wrong pale violet instead of the normal brown or green or blue that marked proper wolves. Albinism, the pack healer had said when she was born, shaking his head with something like pity. Rare and unfortunate, but not unheard of. Cursed, everyone else had whispered, marked by something unnatural, wrong in ways that went deeper than simple coloring. And when she'd reached her 18th birthday without experiencing her first shift, when she'd remained stubbornly human in form, despite the wolf blood that should have run through her veins, the whispers had grown louder. Defective. Broken. Omega too weak to even access her own wolf. Marcus Blackthorne, the alpha who should have been her mate, according to the moon's design, had taken one look at her, standing before him on her 20th birthday, and rejected her with words that still burned like acid 2 years later. I, Marcus Blackthorne, reject you, Seraphina Whitmore. You are cursed, defective, wholly unworthy of standing beside an alpha. Your inability to shift is an abomination that I will not inflict upon my bloodline or my pack. The bond that had been forming between them, fragile and new, had shattered like glass. She'd felt it break inside her chest, a physical pain that had driven her to her knees right there in front of the entire pack gathered for the full moon celebration. No one had helped her up. No one had spoken a word in her defense. She'd picked herself up eventually, spine straight and head high, despite the agony radiating through every cell of her body, and walked away from the bonfire and the celebration and Marcus Blackthorne with what remained of her dignity wrapped around her like armor. "I accept your rejection," she'd said, voice steady despite everything. "May you find a mate more suited to your requirements." The formal words had sealed it, severing whatever connection the goddess had tried to forge between them. She'd gone home to her grandmother, who had held her while she cried and whispered the same thing she always did when the world proved cruel. "They fear what they don't understand, child, and they understand so very little." Her grandmother had been the one to teach her about healing, about the plants that grew in the forest, and the remedies that could be coaxed from root and leaf and flower. Knowledge passed down through generations of women who had served their communities with gentle hands and patient hearts, asking nothing in return except to be allowed to help when help was needed. When the wasting sickness had come to the village last spring, sweeping through the children with terrifying speed, it had been Serafina who'd worked day and night to save them. 17 children had lain burning with fever, their small bodies convulsing, their parents wild with fear and grief. The pack healer had shaken his head and said there was nothing to be done except pray and wait for the goddess to decide who would live and who would die. Serafina had refused to accept that answer. She'd moved from house to house with her basket of herbs and her grandmother's recipes, brewing willow bark tea to bring down fevers, making poultices to draw out infection, forcing water and broth down throats too small and weak to swallow easily. She'd held their hands and sung soft songs and promised their terrified parents that she would do everything in her power to save their babies. 14 children survived. 3 died despite everything she'd tried, despite the sleepless nights and desperate prayers and every remedy she knew. And those 3 deaths had been enough to damn her. The pack had gathered in the square 3 weeks later. She'd thought perhaps they were gathering to thank her, or at least to acknowledge the lives she'd managed to save. Instead, they'd come with accusations and anger and fear, looking for a target. Margaret Stillwater, the miller's wife, who died 6 months earlier in childbed, despite Serafina's best efforts, became the first piece of evidence. The woman had screamed Serafina's name as the fever took her, had called for God to protect her from the witch's evil, even as Serafina held her hand and begged her to drink the fever-reducing tea. She cursed Margaret, the miller had declared, voice shaking with rage and grief that had never properly healed. My wife called out her name with her dying breath. She knew. She knew the white witch had poisoned her. It didn't matter that Serafina had spent 3 days at Margaret's bedside trying desperately to save both mother and child. Didn't matter that she'd successfully delivered the baby boy, who even now thrived in the miller's care. Didn't matter that childbed fever was a known risk that claimed women regardless of the skill of their attendants. The 3 children, who died from the wasting sickness, became the next evidence. Their parents, mad with grief, turned on the one who tried to save them, rather than accept that sometimes death simply couldn't be prevented. The ancient books her grandmother had left her became proof of witchcraft. The herbs hanging in her cottage became components of dark spells. Her inability to shift became evidence of demonic corruption that had twisted her very nature into something unnatural and wrong. The church tribunal had been a formality, the verdict decided before she'd even been dragged before the 3 priests in their black robes. They'd barely glanced at her as they pronounced her guilty of witchcraft, of consorting with demons, of using unholy powers to harm the innocent and deceive the faithful. The sentence was death by burning, to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. She'd been 12 years old when she'd witnessed her first burning, standing in the crowd with her grandmother's warning hand heavy on her shoulder. The woman had been accused of witchcraft for the crime of living alone and knowing too much about plants. Serafina had watched her scream as the flames consumed her. Flesh had smelled the horrible stench of burning hair, and meat had vomited into the dirt, while the crowd cheered and the priest proclaimed God's justice served. Her grandmother had held her afterward, both of them trembling. "That's what they do to women who know too much," the old woman had whispered. "That's the price we pay for healing in a world that prefers ignorance to knowledge." Now 22 years old and waiting for the same home, Serafina understood exactly what her grandmother had meant. The heavy door groaned open with a sound like tormented souls, ancient hinges protesting, as 5 figures entered the cell. Torchlight flooded the small space, momentarily blinding her after 3 days of near darkness. She blinked against the sudden brightness, trying to make out details beyond the silhouettes that seemed to fill the entire room with their presence. They were massive, all of them, standing well over 6 feet, with shoulders that blocked out the light from the corridor beyond. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out armor that gleamed even in the dim illumination, the kind of quality metalwork that spoke of serious wealth and higher rank than common soldiers. The scent hit her a moment later, 5 distinct threads that wove together into something overwhelming. Pine and winter storms and ice from the one who stood slightly ahead of the others. Smoke and whiskey and fire from his mirror image standing at his right hand. Earth and cedar and rain from the one with the tribal tattoos visible on his forearms. Night jasmine and steel from the lean figure who moved with a dancer's grace. Leather and musk and oak from the massive warrior who had to duck slightly to clear the doorway. Alpha, her instincts screamed. Alpha, 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 alpha. 5 of them. 5 alphas of serious power radiating dominance that made her wolf whimper and press close to her consciousness despite her inability to shift. This was more concentrated authority than she'd ever encountered in one place, more raw strength than should have been possible to contain in such a small space. The one who'd entered first commanded attention in a way that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with raw presence. He was taller than the others by half a head, with dark hair that fell past his shoulders in thick waves, some of it pulled back in intricate braids that kept it from his face. His skin was the warm olive tone that marked him as descended from the Mediterranean bloodlines, darker than most men in this northern territory. A scar cut through his left eyebrow, the white line stark against olive skin, giving him a dangerous look that his surprisingly full mouth didn't quite soften. He wore a crimson cloak that marked him as a commander, the heavy fabric falling from his shoulders like a banner of blood. A silver wolf emblazoned on his chest identified him as one of the elite guards who served not just any nobleman, but the territorial governor himself. His hand rested on the pommel of his sword with casual confidence, but his eyes, nearly black in the dim torchlight, swept over Seraphina with an intensity that had nothing to do with duty or violence. They held something else entirely, something that made her skin prickle with awareness and her pulse quicken in her throat despite her fear. "I am Caden Thornwood, commander of this watch," he said, voice deep and resonant, with the kind of authority that came from years of being obeyed without question. "These are my men, Riker, Ashton, Kyle, and Dorian. We are here to ensure you face justice tomorrow and to record your confession tonight." Seraphina lifted her chin despite the way her whole body trembled with exhaustion and terror and the cold that had seeped into her very bones after 3 days in this frigid cell. She met the commander's dark gaze with as much defiance as she could muster, determined not to die a coward, not to give them the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. "I have nothing to confess," she said, pleased when her voice came out steady despite everything. "I'm not a witch, I'm a healer. There's a difference, though I know you don't care to see it." Something flickered in Caden's eyes, too fast to identify. He moved closer with the predatory grace of a hunting cat, each step deliberate and measured, bringing him near enough that she could smell his scent more strongly now. Pine and winter storms and something colder, sharper like ice, forming on a lake in the depths of winter. "The villagers say otherwise," he replied, stopping just outside the reach of her chains. "They say you cursed the miller's wife, that she died, screaming your name and calling for God to protect her from your evil." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Margaret's face twisted in agony flashed through her mind, Margaret's hand gripping hers with desperate strength, Margaret's voice growing weaker with each passing hour, until it was nothing but a whisper begging for help that Seraphina couldn't provide. "She died of childbed fever," Seraphina said, voice shaking now with anger and grief. "I tried to save her. I spent 3 days at her bedside, barely sleeping, doing everything I knew how to do. The baby was turned wrong breech and tangled in the cord. I got the child out alive, a beautiful boy who breathes and thrives even now. But Margaret bled too much during the birth, and then the fever came. Sometimes death claims what it wants, despite everything we do to fight it." Her voice broke on the last words, tears threatening, despite her determination not to cry in front of these men. "Convenient," one of the others said, the one Caden had called Kale, his copper hair gleaming as he moved to lean against the wall. His eyes were a startling green, unusual and sharp. "That all your failures are labeled as God's will, but your successes are called witchcraft." Seraphina's gaze cut to him, seeing the intelligence there. "That's exactly right. When I save someone, I'm a witch using dark powers. When I fail, I'm just a woman who wasn't good enough. Either way, I burn." A tense silence followed her words, heavy and thick. Caden studied her face with an intensity that felt invasive, as if he were trying to read her very soul through the windows of her eyes. When he finally spoke again, his voice had softened slightly, though it still carried absolute command. "How old are you?" 22 summers, Seraphina. whispered voice barely audible over the distant drip of water down the stone walls. 22 years of life, most of them spent in the cottage at the forest's edge, with her grandmother learning the healing arts and the ways of growing things. 22 years, and tomorrow at dawn, it would all end in flame and screaming and the smell of her own flesh burning. And you've never known a man? The question was blunt, invasive in a way that made heat flood her face. But there was something in the way he asked it that wasn't mocking or cruel, almost curious, as if he genuinely wanted to understand rather than simply judge. I lived alone with my grandmother until she died last winter. She said, each word dragged out reluctantly. The villagers came to us for healing when they needed it, when their children burned with fever, or their wives struggled in childbirth, or their husbands broke bones in the fields. But they wouldn't let their sons near me. Said I was strange, said I was touched by something not quite natural. She laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the stone cell. I don't have any special sight. I just know which plants stop bleeding and which ones ease pain and which ones can bring down a fever if you catch it early enough. I'm not magical. I'm not special. I'm just a woman who learned from her grandmother and tried to help people. The isolation in her words hung in the air like smoke. 22 years and never a stolen kiss behind the barn. Never a young man's fumbling attempts at courtship. Never even a hand held in affection beyond her grandmother's papery fingers. Caden took another step closer, eliminating the last bit of safe distance between them. Near enough now that she could see fine details of his face in the flickering torchlight, the individual lashes that framed those impossibly dark eyes, the slight shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way a small muscle jumped in his cheek as he clenched his teeth. His hand rose slowly, giving her time to flinch away if she wanted to. Though where would she go with chains connecting her wrists to the wall above her head? When his calloused fingers finally made contact with her cheek, the touch was so gentle it almost broke her. His palm was warm against her cold skin, rough from years of gripping sword hilts and reins, but impossibly tender. And then something happened that changed everything. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded into sensation. It felt like lightning striking through her chest, like fire, and ice warring for dominance in her veins, like every nerve in her body suddenly coming alive after years of dormancy. She gasped, eyes going wide, and saw her shock reflected in Caden's face as he jerked slightly, hands still against her cheek. Behind him, 4 men went absolutely rigid, their bodies going tense as bowstrings. Riker's eyes flashed from brown to molten silver. Ashton's breath caught audibly in his throat. Cale's hand went to one of his daggers on pure instinct. Dorian took a step forward, then stopped himself with visible effort, and then in perfect unison, all 5 of them spoke a single word that made Seraphina's heart stop beating in her chest. Mate. The word hung in the air between them, like a physical thing heavy with implications that Seraphina's exhausted mind struggled to process. Mate. They'd all said it simultaneously, 5 voices speaking as one, and the certainty in that single syllable was absolute. Impossible. The mate bond was sacred, designed by the goddess herself to connect 2 souls perfectly suited for one another. One alpha, one omega, bound together for life in a partnership that transcended mere physical attraction or romantic love. The bond was supposed to be rare and precious, a gift bestowed on the fortunate few who found their perfect complement in this world. It was never ever supposed to connect 1 omega to 5 alphas simultaneously. Caden's hand remained against her cheek, his palm burning hot against her skin, despite the chill of the cell. His eyes had shifted from nearly black to brilliant silver, the wolf rising to the surface in response to recognizing his mate. Behind him, the other 4 had moved closer, without conscious thought, drawn by the same inexorable pull that had seized Caden the moment he'd touched her. This isn't possible, Seraphina whispered, voice shaking. The bond doesn't work this way. It can't. And yet it does, Riker said, his voice rougher than his twins heated where Caden's had been controlled. He'd moved to stand at Caden's right shoulder, close enough now that she could see he was indeed identical to the commander in every physical detail. Same height, same build, same sharp features and olive skin. But where Caden radiated ice and winter storms, Riker burned with barely contained violence. His eyes were the same molten silver as his brother's, fixed on her with an intensity that made breathing difficult. We all feel it, every single one of us. The pull, the recognition, the absolute certainty that you belong to us and we belong to you. This is unprecedented, Ashton said, moving to her left side with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in his own body. He was slightly shorter than the twins, though still well over 6 feet, with dark hair and eyes that had shifted to amber gold. The tribal tattoos on his forearms seemed to pulse with their own light, I've studied the old texts, the histories of our kind. There are legends of multiple mate bonds, but they're considered myth stories told to entertain rather than actual recorded fact. Maybe the myths were true, Kale suggested, positioning himself behind Ashton. He was leaner than the others, built for speed rather than raw strength, with those unusual green eyes now glowing like emeralds. Maybe this has happened before, and the records were suppressed or lost. Either way, it doesn't change what we're all feeling right now. Dorian, the largest of the five, had moved to complete the circle surrounding her. Up close, his size was even more impressive. Massive shoulders and arms, thick with muscle earned through years of hard training and harder fighting. His face was rough, marked with scars, and a nose that had been broken more than once, but his eyes, now shining pale gold, held unexpected gentleness as he looked at her. "The bond is sacred," he rumbled in that deep voice that seemed to resonate in her chest. "The goddess doesn't make mistakes. If she's chosen to bind all five of us to this Omega, then there's a reason, even if we don't understand it yet." Seraphina's mind was spinning, trying to reconcile what they were saying with everything she'd ever been taught about mate bonds and pack dynamics and the natural order of their world. She was already an anomaly, an Omega who couldn't shift, marked as cursed and defective by everyone who'd ever known her. And now these five powerful alphas were claiming she was their mate, all of them. "You're mistaken," she said, voice firmer now despite her confusion. "You have to be. I'm broken, remember, cursed. Defective. I can't even shift into my wolf form. The mate bond wouldn't choose someone like me for five alphas of your obvious power and status." "The bond doesn't lie," Caden said quietly, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone in a gesture so tender it made her throat tight. "Whatever you think you are, whatever they've told you about being broken or cursed, the goddess sees something different. She sees our mate. Our Omega," Riker added, reaching out to touch a strand of her white hair, letting it slide through his fingers like silk. "Ours to protect, to cherish, to claim." The word claim sent a jolt of something hot and dangerous through Seraphina's body, a sensation she'd never experienced before but recognized instinctively. Want, need, desire that had nothing to do with logic or caution and everything to do with the primal recognition of mates finding each other. But reality crashed back in like cold water, finding her exactly where she was and what tomorrow would bring. "I'm sentenced to burn at dawn," she said, the words like ash in her mouth. "In a few hours, they're going to drag me to the pyre and set me on fire while the village watches and the priests declare God's justice served. Your mate bond, whatever it is, won't matter when I'm dead." The temperature in the cell seemed to drop 10 degrees as all five alphas went utterly still. The kind of stillness that predators exhibited right before they struck, right before violence exploded into motion and blood painted the ground red. "No," Caden said, and the single word carried such absolute authority that it felt like a physical force. "That's not going to happen." "You can't stop it," Seraphina replied, exhaustion and 3 days of terror making her voice flat. "You're here to guard me, to make sure I don't escape. That's your duty, your orders. You can't just—" "Watch us," Riker interrupted, voice hard as steel. "You're our mate. Do you really think we're going to stand by and let anyone harm you? Let anyone put you in a pyre and light the fucking kindling?" "You'll be executed for treason," she pointed out, trying to make them see reason, even as hope began to unfurl in her chest like a fragile flower. "All of you. The church doesn't forgive those who interfere with their judgments. Neither does the governor. You'd be throwing away your lives, your positions, your honor." "Honor," Ashton said softly, "is doing what's right, not what's ordered. And letting our innocent mate burn would be the most dishonorable thing we could possibly do." "How do you know I'm innocent?" The question came out bitter. "You just met me. For all you know, everything they've accused me of is true. Maybe I am a witch who curses people and consorts with demons." Kale laughed, the sound surprisingly warm despite the grim circumstances. "If you were actually a witch with real power, do you think you'd still be chained in this cell? You'd have blasted your way out 3 days ago. The mate bond wouldn't have formed if you were truly evil." Dorian added, his massive hand coming to rest on her shoulder with careful gentleness. "The goddess doesn't bind good wolves to corrupt souls. If all five of us recognize you as mate, then you're exactly what you claim to be. A healer, an innocent, someone worth protecting." Seraphina felt tears burning behind her eyes, the first real tears she'd allowed herself since this nightmare began. 3 days of maintaining her composure, of refusing to break down and give the guards and priests the satisfaction of seeing her cry, and now these five strangers with their impossible bond and their fierce declarations were crumbling her defenses with nothing but gentle touches and absolute certainty. I don't understand, she whispered. How can this be real? How can the goddess bind 5 alphas to 1 omega? It doesn't make sense. Maybe it doesn't have to make sense, Caden said, his other hand coming up to cup her face between both his palms, forcing her to meet his eyes. Maybe we just have to accept what is and deal with the implications later. Right now, all that matters is keeping you alive and getting you out of here before dawn. The execution is set for first light, Ashton said, his voice taking on a tactical quality as he shifted into planning mode. That gives us approximately 6 hours. The guard rotation changes in 2 hours. We're scheduled to remain here until dawn, at which point the execution party will arrive to collect the prisoner. So we have until the rotation change to make our move, Riker said, falling easily into the strategic discussion. Any later and we'll have to fight our way through additional guards. Any earlier and we risk the change happening while we're still in transit. Wait, Serafina interrupted, looking between them with growing alarm. You're actually planning to break me out. To defy direct orders from the church and the governor, you'll be hunted for the rest of your lives. Then we'll run far enough that they can't find us, Kale said with a shrug, as if discussing what to have for dinner rather than treason and exile. There are territories beyond the colonial settlements, places where the church's authority doesn't reach. We can disappear into the wilderness, establish our own pack. 5 alphas and 1 omega trying to survive in the wild. Serafina shook her head. That's not a plan, that's suicide. You need a pack for protection, for resources for... We are a pack, Dorian cut in gently. The 6 of us. That's all we need. The simple certainty in his words struck something deep in Serafina's chest. A pack. A family. Something she'd lost when her grandmother died, when Marcus rejected her, when the village turned on her with torches and accusations. These 5 alphas, powerful and dangerous, and completely insane, were offering her belonging in a way she'd never had before. There has to be another way, she said, desperation creeping into her voice. Some way that doesn't end with all of you becoming fugitives. Can't you appeal to the governor, demand a proper trial? The trial already happened, Caden reminded, her voice gentle but firm. And you were found guilty. The church's verdict is final unless we can prove you were wrongly convicted, and we don't have time to gather evidence before dawn. Then what about after? Serafina pressed. Break me out tonight, hide me somewhere safe, and then work to prove my innocence. Clear my name so we don't have to spend the rest of our lives running. Riker and Caden exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between the twins. Ashton's expression turned thoughtful, his mind clearly working through the possibilities. Kale tilted his head, considering, while Dorian remained focused on Serafina with that steady, patient attention. It's not impossible, Ashton said slowly. If we could gather testimony from the people you've helped, prove that your healing comes from knowledge rather than witchcraft, show the pattern of false accusations. The miller still has his son, Serafina said quickly, hope making her words tumble over each other. The boy I delivered when Margaret died. He's healthy and whole and living proof that I tried to save his mother, not curse her. And the children who survived the wasting sickness, their parents could testify that I worked myself nearly to death trying to help them. The 3 who died will weigh heavier, Kale pointed out. Grief makes people want someone to blame. But 14 living children against 3 deaths, Serafina argued. That's not witchcraft, that's just the reality of disease and medicine. Sometimes you can't save everyone no matter how hard you try. We'd need more than just testimony, Caden said, his strategic mind clearly engaged now. We'd need someone with enough authority to challenge the church's verdict, someone the governor would listen to. Lord Ashford, Riker said suddenly, the governor's chief advisor. He's known for being fair-minded, for actually investigating before passing judgment. If we could get him to look into this case. He's currently traveling the Northern Territories, Ashton interrupted. Won't be back for at least a week, maybe 2. Then we buy time, Caden decided, his voice taking on that tone of absolute command again. Get her out tonight. Hide her somewhere the church can't find her, and work on building our case while we wait for Ashford's return. Where would we hide her? Dorian asked practically. Every pack in the territory will be searching once they discover she's escaped. We can't exactly walk into an inn with a fugitive Omega who glows white in the dark. The old hunting cabin, Riker suggested, 3 days north in the deep forest. Father used it before he died, but it's been abandoned for years. No one goes that far into the wild anymore. It's defensible, Caden agreed, and remote enough that casual searchers won't find it. We'd have to supply it, make it livable for potentially several weeks. Then we start now, Kale said, pushing off from the wall where he'd been leaning. Dorian and I can make a supply run tonight, get everything we need, and transport it to the cabin before dawn. You three stay here, maintain the appearance of following orders until the rotation change. And when they discover I'm gone, Serafina asked, still struggling to believe this was actually happening. When they find this cell empty at dawn, by then we'll be long gone, Caden assured her. All six of us vanished into the forest with enough supplies to last weeks if necessary. They can search all they want. They won't find us. It was a plan, not a perfect plan full of risks and variables they couldn't control, but an actual plan that ended with her alive instead of burning. Serafina wanted to accept it, wanted to throw herself into their arms and trust them to save her, but years of disappointment and betrayal made her hesitate. Why, she whispered, looking at each of them in turn. Why would you risk everything for someone you just met, mate bond? Or not, you don't know me. Don't know if I'm worth saving, if I'll live up to whatever expectations you have. Caden's expression softened, his hand still cradling her face with infinite tenderness. The bond doesn't just tell us you're our mate. It tells us everything we need to know about your soul, your courage, your compassion, your strength. We feel your grief over the people you couldn't save, your determination to help, despite knowing the risk, your refusal to break even after 3 days in this hell. You're worth saving because you exist. Riker added, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder opposite Dorian's. Because the goddess chose you for us. Because you're ours and we protect what's ours with everything we have. Beset, Kale said with a slightly wicked grin. I've always wanted to tell the church exactly where they can shove their sanctimonious judgments. This seems like the perfect opportunity. Despite everything, despite the terror and uncertainty and the chains still binding her wrists, Serafina felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. It came out half sob, but it was genuine, the first real laughter she'd managed in months. You're all insane, she said, but there was no heat in it, only wonder, and the first fragile threads of trust. Probably, Ashton agreed easily, but we're your insane alphas now, so you're stuck with us. The possessive phrasing sent another one of those hot jolts through her system, and Serafina realized with a start that her body was responding to their nearness in ways that had nothing to do with fear or caution. The mate bond was pulling at her, urging her to move closer, to accept their touch, to surrender to the connection that thrummed between all six of them like a living thing. I need to lower the chains, Caden said, his voice dropping to something rougher, darker. Need to get you out of these shackles. Will you let me do that? The fact that he asked, that he requested permission, even though he clearly had every intention of freeing her regardless, made something warm unfurl in Serafina's chest. Yes, she said softly. Please. Caden moved to the mechanism on the wall, examining the ancient pulley system that controlled the length of chain. With a few quick movements, he released the lock and began lowering the chain slowly, carefully, giving her arms time to adjust to the change in position after 3 days stretched overhead. The relief was so profound that Serafina gasped, tears springing to her eyes as blood rushed back into her hands, and the burning agony in her shoulders began to ease. Her arms came down gradually until they hung at her sides, still connected by a short length of chain between the shackles on her wrists, but at least she could move. Now could lower her arms and ease the screaming muscles. Dorian stepped forward immediately, his massive hands impossibly gentle, as he lifted one of her wrists to examine where the iron had rubbed her skin raw. The wounds weren't deep, but they were angry and red, clearly painful. He pressed his lips to the damaged skin with such tenderness that Serafina's breath caught. You'll wear our marks eventually, he said quietly, but they'll be marks of pleasure and claiming, not pain and imprisonment. The words should have frightened her, should have made her pull away from these 5 strangers who spoke so casually about claiming and marking and forever. Instead, she felt herself leaning into Dorian's touch, craving more of the warmth and safety these alphas represented. Riker moved behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders, kneading the knotted muscles with skilled fingers. Let us help, he murmured against her ear, his breath hot on her skin. Let us take care of you the way a mate should be cared for. I don't understand what's happening, Serafina admitted, voice shaking slightly. I feel strange, like my body knows something my mind hasn't caught up to yet. That's the bond, Ashton explained, moving to stand in front of her, while Riker continued his massage from behind. It's trying to complete itself, urging us toward the final claiming that will seal the connection permanently. The final claiming, Serafina repeated, the implications of those words sinking in. You mean sex, Kale supplied bluntly, though his smile was gentle. The mate bond isn't fully sealed until it's consummated. That's when the marks appear, when the connection becomes permanent and unbreakable. Heat flooded Serafina's face, burning from her chest up to her hairline. She was 22 years old and had never been kissed, never been touched by a man in any intimate way, never even considered the mechanics of sex beyond the basic biology required for her healing work. And now these five gorgeous, powerful alphas were discussing, claiming her as casually as they might discuss the weather. I've never. Yon, she started then stopped unsure how to articulate her complete lack of experience. We know, Caden said gently, his hand coming up to cup her burning cheek. We can sense it through the bond, your innocence, your inexperience, which is why we'll be patient, careful. This will happen at your pace with your permission every step of the way. But you want to, Serafina said, not quite a question. She could see it in their eyes, in the tension of their bodies, in the way they held themselves with careful control around her. Want to claim me? More than we've wanted anything in our lives, Riker admitted roughly. But wanting and taking are different things. We're not animals. We can control ourselves. Wait until you're ready, until you choose this freely. The fact that they were giving her choice, that they acknowledged her agency, even in this moment when she was technically their prisoner, their responsibility meant more than Serafina could articulate. Marcus had rejected her without ever asking what she wanted. The village had condemned her without caring about her voice. But these five alphas, who had every reason to simply take what the bond told them was theirs, were asking for permission. I'm going to die tomorrow. Serafina heard herself say the words coming from some deep place of honesty she'd been trying to suppress. If your plan fails, if we can't get away or can't prove my innocence, I'm going to burn. And I'll die never having known what it feels like to be touched, to be wanted, to be loved. The silence that followed her words was heavy with understanding and something darker, more primal. We're not going to let you die, Caden said fiercely. I don't care what we have to do, who we have to fight, how far we have to run. You're not dying tomorrow or any day soon, so if we have anything to say about it. But if I did, Serafina pressed, needing to finish this thought, needing them to understand what she was asking. If the worst happens and we can't prevent it, I don't want to die never having experienced this, whatever this is between us. Kale moved closer, his green eyes intense as they searched her face. Are you asking us to claim you tonight before the escape attempt? I'm asking, Serafina said carefully. What would happen if I said yes? If I wanted to know what the mate bond feels like when it's complete? What it's like to be touched by someone who actually wants me instead of rejecting me for being broken? You're not broken, Riker growled, his hands tightening slightly on her shoulders. Say that again and I'll spend the next hour proving exactly how perfect you are. The threat sent a shiver through Serafina's body that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with anticipation. Then prove it, she whispered, making her choice. Show me I'm not broken. Show me what it means to be wanted. For a long moment, no one moved. Five alphas stood frozen, staring at the small Omega who'd just given them permission to claim her, to complete the mate bond, to make her theirs in the most fundamental way possible. Then Caden leaned down and kissed her, and Serafina's entire world caught fire. His lips were warm and firm against hers, moving with patient skill that made her head spin. This was nothing like she'd imagined a kiss would be, based on the few romantic tales her grandmother had told. This was consuming, overwhelming, a sensation that seemed to spread from her mouth through her entire body like liquid heat. She gasped against his lips, and he used the opportunity to deepen the kiss, his tongue sliding against hers in a rhythm that made her knees go weak. His hands framed her face, holding her steady as he explored her mouth with thorough attention, teaching her how to kiss him back, how to meet his tongue with her own, how to pour everything she was feeling into this single point of connection. When he finally pulled back, they were both breathing hard. Serafina's eyes were wide, her lips swollen, her body trembling with sensations she'd never experienced before. That was your first kiss, Caden said, voice rough with barely controlled desire. And it will be the first of thousands. We're going to kiss you until you forget your own name, until the only thing you know is that you're ours and we're yours. My turn, Riker said, turning her in his arms so she faced him instead of his twin. His kiss was different, hotter, more demanding. Where Caden had been patient and thorough, Riker was fire and hunger, claiming her mouth like he was staking a claim to her very soul. Serafina whimpered into the kiss, overwhelmed by the intensity, by the way her body responded without conscious thought, arching into him, seeking more contact, more heat, more of everything. When Riker released her, Ashton was there, his kiss slower, sweeter, but no less consuming. Then Kale, playful and teasing, making her laugh even as desire coiled tighter in her belly. Finally, Dorian, gentle despite his size, worshipful in a way that made her feel precious and cherished. 5 kisses from 5 alphas each. Different, each perfect, each driving home the reality that she wasn't alone anymore, wasn't unwanted or broken or cursed. She was theirs, and they were hers. The heavy cloak Dorian had been wearing now lay spread across the cold stone floor, creating a makeshift bed that was infinitely more comfortable than bare rock. Kale had slipped out and returned with additional blankets and furs from their supplies, building a nest of softness in the corner, farthest from the door, where shadows provided at least the illusion of privacy. Serafina stood in the center of the five alphas, her torn shift hanging loosely from her shoulders, the chains between her wrists catching torchlight as she trembled. Not from fear, though there was some of that threaded through the anticipation and desire that made her skin feel too tight and her breath come short. She trembled because every nerve in her body was awake and aware in ways she'd never experienced before. "We should establish rules," Caden said, his voice taking on that commanding quality that made something deep in Serafina's Omega nature want to submit to trust, to follow wherever he led. "Boundaries. This is your first time experiencing intimacy of any kind. We need to make sure you feel safe, that you can stop this at any point if it becomes too much." "Rules," Serafina repeated, trying to focus despite the way Riker's scent of smoke and whiskey was making her head spin. "What kind of rules?" "A safe word," Ashton supplied, moving to kneel on the nest of blankets, his amber eyes serious despite the hunger she could see burning in their depths. "A word you can say if you need us to stop immediately, no questions asked. Something you wouldn't normally say during intimate activities." "Mercy," Serafina said after a moment's thought. The word felt appropriate given their circumstances, given that she was asking these five alphas for mercy of a different kind than the church would ever grant. "If I say mercy, you stop, all of you." "Mercy," Caden repeated the word, a solemn vow. "The moment you speak it, everything stops. I don't care if we're in the middle of claiming you, if we're seconds from completion. You say that word and we stop immediately." "Understood." He directed the last word at his companions, and each of them nodded agreement, the oath passing between them like a sacred contract. Communication. Kale added, his green eyes bright with intelligence and something softer, more tender. "You tell us what feels good, what doesn't, what you want more of or less of. Your pleasure matters more than ours tonight. This is about showing you what it means to be worshipped, to be cherished." The idea that her pleasure could matter more than theirs, that these five powerful alphas would prioritize her inexperienced wants over their own obvious desire, made Serafina's throat tight with emotion. "I don't know what I want," she admitted quietly. "I don't have any context for this, any experience to draw on." "Then we'll teach you," Riker said, moving closer until she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "We'll explore together, find what makes you gasp, what makes you moan, what makes you forget everything except the pleasure we're giving you." "One more rule," Dorian rumbled from behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders with careful gentleness. "You're in control. You set the pace. If you want us to slow down, we slow down. If you want to stop and just talk, we talk. This night belongs to you, little Omega. We're just honored to be part of it." The tenderness in his words was almost harder to bear than the desire. Serafina had armored herself against cruelty, against rejection, against the harsh judgment of a world that saw her as defective. But she had no defense against kindness, against five alphas who looked at her like she was precious and rare and worth protecting. "I want this," she said, voice steadier now. "I want to know what the mate bond feels like when it's complete. Want to experience pleasure before I potentially face pain. Want to feel alive and wanted and loved." "Not just for tonight," Caden corrected gently, his hand cupping her face with that same impossible tenderness. "Forever. The claiming we do here will bind us permanently. When we mark you, when the bond completes, that's for the rest of our lives, however long or short they may be." The weight of that commitment should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like coming home. "Forever, then," Serafina agreed. "Show me what forever feels like." Caden kissed her again, slower, this time more thorough. His hands moved from her face to her shoulders, then down her arms, careful of the raw wounds at her wrists. When he reached the chains connecting the shackles, he paused, pulling back just enough to meet her eyes. "These need to come off," he said. "I can't properly touch you with iron in the way." He produced a small key from somewhere in his armor, and Serafina realized with a start that he'd had the means to free her from the beginning, had chosen to leave her chained until she gave permission, until she was ready to accept what freedom with them would mean. The shackles fell away with soft metallic clinks. Serafina brought her hands up, examining her wrists in the flickering torchlight. The skin was raw and red, painful to look at. Dorian caught one hand then the other, bringing each wrist to his lips in turn. He kissed the damaged skin with reverence. I wish I could heal these for you, he murmured. You are healing them, Serafina said softly. Not the physical wounds, but something deeper. Something I didn't even realize was broken until you five showed me what it felt like to be whole. Riker moved behind her, his hands finding the torn shoulder of her shift. May I? He asked, fingers gentle against the fabric. Yes, Serafina breathed, and he carefully drew the garment down her arms and off her body, leaving her standing naked before five alphas, who looked at her like she was art, like she was divine, like she was everything. The torchlight painted her pale skin in shades of gold and amber, making her white hair seem to glow like captured moonlight. Her body was slender, the kind of thinness that came from too many meals missed and too much worry carried. Her breasts were small but perfectly formed, tipped with nipples that had already hardened in the cool air and under the weight of five hungry gazes. Beautiful, Ashton breathed, reaching out to trace one finger along her collarbone. Absolutely beautiful. I'm too thin, Serafina said, old insecurities rising. Too pale, too strange. Perfect, Kale interrupted firmly. Your body is perfect. Every inch of skin that we're going to learn with our hands and mouths until you believe us when we say you're the most gorgeous creature we've ever seen. The explicit language should have shocked her. Instead, it sent heat pooling low in her belly, made her thighs clench with unfamiliar need. Caden guided her down onto the nest of blankets, arranging her gently on her back, with her white hair spread around her like a halo. The furs were soft beneath her, infinitely more comfortable than the cold stone she'd endured for 3 days. We're going to touch you now, Caden said, kneeling beside her while the other four positioned themselves around the nest. Going to explore every inch of you. If anything feels wrong or uncomfortable, you tell us immediately. Understand? I understand. Serafina confirmed, her voice trembling with anticipation. Caden's hands settled on her stomach, palm flat and warm against her skin. Just that simple touch, sent sparks radiating outward, made her breath catch. He moved his hands slowly upward, fingers tracing the line of her ribs, the underside of her breast circling, but not quite touching, the hardened peak that ached for contact. Please, Serafina heard herself whisper. Patience, Caden murmured, but his fingers finally closed around one small breast thumb, brushing across the sensitive nipple, in a movement that made Serafina's back arch off the blankets. Good girl, let us hear you. Riker claimed her other breast, his touch rougher than his twins, more demanding. The contrast between them, ice and fire control and hunger, made Serafina's head spin. Ashton's hands found her legs, stroking from ankle to knee to thigh with patient thoroughness. His touch was soothing even as it stoked the fire building in her core. Kale leaned down to kiss her, swallowing her gasp as Caden's mouth replaced his hand on her breast, tongue swirling around the peaked nipple before he sucked it between his lips. The dual sensations made Serafina whimper and writhe against the blankets. Dorian's massive hands settled on her head, fingers threading through her white hair with infinite gentleness. You're doing so well, he praised, voice a low rumble. Taking everything we're giving you, letting us worship you the way you deserve. The praise made something warm unfurl in Serafina's chest. She'd spent so long being told she was wrong. Broken, cursed. Hearing these alphas speak to her with approval and admiration was almost as intoxicating as their touches. Ashton's hands moved higher on her thighs, spreading them gently, opening her to cool air and heated gazes. Serafina tensed instinctively, suddenly aware of her vulnerability. Breathe, Ashton commanded softly. We're not going to hurt you. Everything we do is designed to bring you pleasure. Trust us. Serafina forced herself to breathe, to relax the muscles that had gone tight with nerves. She trusted them, she realized. Trusted these five alphas who'd known her for less than an hour, but who looked at her like she was precious. You're wet, Ashton observed, his voice rough with appreciation. Already slick for us, even though we've barely touched you. Your body knows what it wants, even if your mind hasn't caught up yet. His finger traced through her folds, collecting the evidence of her arousal, and Serafina cried out at the sensation. It was too much and not enough, simultaneously, pleasure so sharp it almost hurt. That's your entrance, Ashton explained, finger circling, but not penetrating. Where we'll eventually claim you join our bodies with yours. But first, we're going to make sure you're ready. Make sure you understand what pleasure feels like. His finger moved higher, finding a small bundle of nerves that made Serafina's entire body go rigid when he touched it. This, he said, circling the sensitive spot with careful pressure, is purely for pleasure. The goddess gave this to Omegas as a gift, and we're going to worship it until you can't remember your own name. He wasn't exaggerating. The sensation of his skilled fingers working that spot while Caden and Riker continued their attention to her breasts, while Kale kissed her breathless and Dorian stroked her hair, and murmured praise built into something immense and terrifying and absolutely necessary. I feel strange, Serafina gasped against Kale's mouth. Like something's building, like I'm climbing towards something, but I don't know what. Oh, that's your climax approaching. Ashton explained, his fingers never stopping their patient circles. When it hits, it's going to feel overwhelming, like your whole body is coming apart. Don't fight it. Just let go and let the pleasure take you. I can't, Serafina whimpered because it felt too intense, too much. You can, Caden said firmly, his hand coming to rest on her throat, not squeezing, just holding, grounding her. You're strong enough to take this. Strong enough to accept the pleasure we're giving you. Let go, Serafina. Come for us. The command in his voice, combined with Ashton's skilled fingers and the overwhelming sensation of being touched by 5 alphas, simultaneously finally pushed Serafina over the edge. The climax hit like lightning, pleasure exploding through her body in waves so intense she screamed. Her back arched completely off the blankets, her hands fisting in the furs beneath her. Her entire being focused on the sensation radiating outward from where Ashton's fingers still worked her through the peak. And as she shattered, as pleasure consumed her completely, her skin began to glow. It started as a faint shimmer, barely visible in the torchlight, like moonlight reflecting off water. But as the climax continued, as wave after wave of pleasure crashed through her, the glow intensified until her entire body was radiating soft silver light that turned the dim cell into something approaching daylight. The 5 alphas froze, staring at her with expressions of awe and wonder and sudden understanding. Moon-blessed, Caden breathed the words reverent. She's moon-blessed. The ancient bloodline thought extinct for 3 centuries. Omegas marked by the goddess herself, capable of extraordinary power, recognized by their pale coloring and the silver light that manifested during moments of intense emotion or pleasure. That's why you can't shift, Ashton said, his voice filled with wonder as he traced patterns in the light emanating from her skin. Moon-blessed don't have normal wolf forms. Your connection to the goddess is too strong, too direct. You're not broken or cursed. You're sacred. Serafina barely heard them, still lost in the aftershocks of her first orgasm, in the way her body continued to pulse with pleasure, in the strange sensation of light pouring from her skin like she'd swallowed the moon. When she finally came back to herself, gasping and trembling, the glow had faded to barely visible shimmer. She looked up at 5 alphas who were staring at her with expressions that had shifted from simple desire into something approaching reverence. I don't understand, she whispered. What just happened? The goddess marked you, Dorian said softly, his large hand gentle as it stroked her hair. Claimed you as one of her own. The moon-blessed are legend stories we tell children about Omegas, so powerful and pure that the goddess herself blessed their bloodline with her light. But I'm not powerful, Serafina protested weakly. I can't even shift. I'm just a healer who knows plants. You're so much more than that, Riker said fiercely. And those idiots who tried to burn you have no idea what they almost destroyed. A moon-blessed hasn't been born in over 300 years. You're not just rare, you're irreplaceable. Which means, Caden said, his voice taking on a new urgency, we need to complete at least one bond before we move. If the church discovers what you are, they won't just burn you. They'll try to harness your power, turn you into a weapon or a symbol. The mate bond will offer some protection, make it harder for them to use you. He stood, beginning to remove his armor with efficient movements. We have maybe an hour before we need to leave. I'm claiming you now, Serafina, forming the first permanent bond. The others will have to wait until we reach safety. Serafina watched him strip away layer after layer of clothing and armor until he stood before her in nothing but his skin. His body was a warrior's body, all lean muscle and controlled power, marked with scars that told stories of battles fought and won. His olive skin seemed to glow in the torchlight, and his eyes, still silver with his wolf so close to the surface, never left hers. Are you ready for this? He asked, kneeling between her spread thighs. Ready to be mine, to let me inside your body, to mark you as my mate? Yes, Serafina whispered, reaching up to touch his face, marveling at the fact that this powerful alpha was asking her permission, was giving her choice even now. Yes, I'm ready. Show me what it means to be yours. Caden lowered himself over her, supporting his weight on his forearms as he positioned himself at her entrance. This will hurt at first, he said honestly. Your body isn't used to this, and I'm not a small man, but I'll go slowly, give you time to adjust. And after the initial discomfort passes, I promise you'll feel nothing but pleasure. He pressed forward slowly, carefully, and Serafina gasped at the sensation of being stretched, filled, invaded in a way that was foreign and overwhelming. There was a sharp sting as he breached her maidenhead, a moment of burning discomfort that made her tense beneath him. Breathe, Caden commanded softly, holding still inside her, giving her body time to accommodate his size. Just breathe through it. The worst is over. He was right. As her body adjusted, as the initial pain faded, Serafina became aware of other sensations. The fullness of having him inside her, the way her inner muscles stretched and clenched around him, the heat of his skin against hers, the way his heart beat in rhythm with her own. Move, she whispered. Please, Caden. I need you to move. He did, withdrawing slowly before pressing back and establishing a rhythm that was patient and controlled, despite the tension she could feel thrumming through his entire body. Each thrust sent sparks of sensation through her pleasure, building with every movement. You feel incredible. Caden groaned, his control beginning to fray at the edges. So tight, so perfect. Made for me. Made for us. His hand slid between their bodies, finding that bundle of nerves Ashton had worshipped earlier, circling it in time with his thrusts. The dual stimulation was almost too much pleasure, building rapidly toward another peak. I'm going to mark you now, Caden said, his voice rough with need and something deeper, more primal. Going to bite your neck and seal our bond. It will hurt for just a moment, but then you'll feel the connection snap into place. You'll feel me inside your mind as well as your body. Are you ready? Yes, Serafina gasped, her second climax approaching rapidly. Yes, mark me. Make me yours. Caden's thrusts increased in speed and power, driving deeper, harder, pushing her closer and closer to the edge. And then, just as her climax hit, just as pleasure exploded through her system in waves even more intense than the first time Caden's teeth sank into the junction of her neck and shoulder. The pain was sharp and bright, lasting only a second before it transformed into something else entirely. The mate bond, which had been forming since the moment he first touched her, suddenly snapped into place with an almost audible click. Serafina could feel Caden inside her mind, could sense his emotions as clearly as her own. His love, his devotion, his absolute determination to protect her with his life if necessary. And through their connection, she felt his own climax hit, felt the moment he spilled himself inside her with a roar that echoed off the stone walls. His release triggered another wave of pleasure in her own body, extending her orgasm until she thought she might actually die from the intensity of it. When it finally ended, when they both lay gasping and trembling in the aftermath, Serafina became aware of her skin glowing again, brighter this time, the silver light pulsing in rhythm with their synchronized heartbeats. The bond is complete, Caden said, his voice filled with wonder and satisfaction. You're mine now, Serafina. My mate, my omega, my queen. And I am yours for the rest of our lives. He pulled out of her carefully, and immediately Riker was there with a damp cloth, cleaning her gently, while Ashton helped her into the borrowed clothes they'd brought. Kale and Dorian stood guard at the door, listening for any sound of approaching guards. We need to move, Riker said, though his eyes lingered on Serafina with obvious hunger and regret. The rotation changes in 40 minutes. If we're going to get out of here, it has to be now. Caden helped Serafina to her feet, steadying her when her legs threatened to give out. The claiming had taken more out of her than she'd realized, her body exhausted from the intensity of the experience. But through the bondage, she could feel Caden's strength supporting her, lending her energy when her own reserves were depleted. Can you walk? He asked quietly. I can do whatever I need to do to get out of here alive, Serafina replied, determination steadying her voice. Let's go. They moved through the corridors of the prison with practiced stealth, Kale and Dorian taking point, Caden and Riker, flanking Serafina, Ashton bringing up the rear. The stone walls were silent around them, most of the cells empty. At this hour, the few prisoners present too lost in their own misery to notice 5 armed men escorting a small figure wrapped in a borrowed cloak. The main gate loomed ahead, guarded by a single soldier who straightened at their approach. Serafina recognized him, one of the fathers whose child she'd saved during the wasting sickness. His eyes widened when he saw her face beneath the hood, understanding dawning. Commander, he said quietly, I didn't see anything. My watch ends in 10 minutes. What happens after that is not my concern. Thank you, Thomas, Caden said, genuine gratitude in his voice. Your daughter, how is she? Healthy and thriving thanks to this one, Thomas replied, his gaze shifting to Serafina. Whatever they say about you, miss, I know the truth. You saved my little girl when everyone else said there was nothing to be done. I won't forget that. Tears stung Serafina's eyes. Take care of her, she whispered, and if anyone asks, you never saw us. Never saw who? Thomas asked with a slight smile, stepping aside to let them pass. They slipped through the gate and into the forest beyond, moving quickly through the undergrowth, and behind them the prison remained silent. No alarm raised, no pursuit immediately evident. But Serafina knew it was only a matter of time. When dawn came and they found her cell empty, when they discovered that 5 of the governor's elite guards had vanished along with their prisoner, the hunt would begin in earnest. "How far to the cabin?" she asked Caden, through their new bond, marveling at the ease of the mental communication. 3 days hard travel, he replied the same way. "We'll move through the night, put as much distance as possible between us and the prison before they discover you're gone." Dorian and Kale went ahead earlier to stock the cabin with supplies. "We'll meet them there." The night was dark around them, the moon hidden behind clouds, but Serafina's skin provided its own illumination, a soft silver glow that lit their path through the forest. The 4 alphas surrounding her moved with practiced ease, warriors comfortable in the wilderness protecting their mate from any threat that might emerge from the shadows. As they traveled, Serafina felt the mate bond with Caden growing stronger, settling into place like a foundation that would support whatever came next. She could sense his thoughts, his feelings, his unwavering determination to keep her safe. And through him, she could feel the presence of the other 4 waiting for their own chance to complete the bond, to make her theirs in the same permanent, unbreakable way. Dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky when they finally stopped to rest, finding a small cave hidden behind a waterfall where they could shelter for a few hours. Serafina was exhausted, her body pushed beyond its limits by the escape and the long night of travel. But she was alive. She was free. And she was surrounded by 4 alphas who looked at her like she was the most precious thing in their world. "Sleep," Caden commanded, gently pulling her down beside him on a bed of moss and leaves. "We're safe here for now. I'll keep watch." Serafina wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could help keep watch, but her eyes were already closing, her body surrendering to the exhaustion. The last thing she felt before sleep claimed her was Caden's arms around her, his warmth chasing away the chill of the night, and through their bond, his love wrapping around her heart like a shield. They would reach the cabin. They would complete the remaining bonds. They would gather evidence to prove her innocence. And somehow, against all odds, they would build a life together. But for now, she slept held safe in the arms of her first mate, while the forest whispered secrets around them, and the dawn broke on the first day of her new life. The stone courtyard was packed with wolves from 5 territories, all gathered to witness the official claiming ceremony that would cement Serafina's position as Luna Queen. Lord Ashford stood at the front, his investigation having revealed not just Serafina's innocence, but a network of corruption within the church that stretched far beyond a single false accusation. Father Aldrich, the priest who had condemned her, had fled when the investigation began. Marcus Blackthorne, who had rejected her so cruelly, stood now in chains awaiting judgment for his role in the conspiracy. It turned out he'd known about Serafina's moon. Blessed Heritage had rejected her specifically to prevent her from gaining power, working with corrupt church officials who feared what a moon-blessed Omega might mean for their control over the territory. The governor himself had apologized publicly, had offered Serafina land and title and protection. But she'd chosen something different. She'd chosen to establish a new territory with her 5 mates, a place where healing was valued over fear, where knowledge was celebrated rather than condemned, where the old ways could blend with the new. Now standing in the center of the courtyard with 5 Alpha Kings surrounding her, Serafina felt the power of the goddess flowing through her veins. Over the past 3 months, she'd learned to control her abilities, to call the silver light at will, to use her connection to the moon, to heal wounds that would have been fatal, to sense threats before they materialized. She'd also completed the bond with all 5 of her mates. Riker had claimed her in the cabin, his fire burning away the last of her doubts. Ashton had marked her under the full moon, his calm strength grounding her when the power threatened to overwhelm. Kale had taken her with playful joy, teaching her that claiming could be fun as well as sacred. And Dorian, gentle despite his size, had worshipped her body until she understood that she was truly cherished, truly valued, truly loved. Each bond had added another thread to the connection that linked all 6 of them, until Serafina could feel her mates as clearly as she felt her own heartbeat, could communicate with them across distances, could draw on their strength when she needed it, could offer them her own power in return. "Are you ready?" Caden asked through their bond, his hand warm in hers. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," Serafina replied, squeezing his fingers. She raised her hands, calling on the goddess's power, and silver light exploded outward from her skin. Every wolf in the courtyard dropped to their knees, unable to withstand the divine presence that radiated from their new Luna Queen. And as the pack began to chant her name, as her 5 mates surrounded her with their love and their strength and their unwavering devotion, Serafina finally understood what her grandmother had tried to tell her all those years ago. She wasn't cursed. She was blessed. Moon, blessed. Chosen by the goddess to bring change to a world that desperately needed it. Chosen to be the mate of 5 Alpha Kings who would help her build something better than what had come before. She'd been condemned to burn. Instead, she'd risen from the ashes more powerful than anyone could have imagined. And with her mates at her side, there was nothing she couldn't accomplish. The future stretched before them, bright and full of possibility. And Serafina walked into it with her head held high, her heart full of love, and her soul finally completely perfectly whole.